It's a case that involves hundreds of victims. A lot of them will never get their money back.
I'm here to tell you guys the biggest reason why customers get scammed by pool contractors, and I'm here to tell you the story of the biggest case in Florida that's ever happened, and it was specifically here in Brevard County and outlying areas, and I'm here to tell you the solution of how to not let it happen to you. Hey guys, I'm Steven with Aquatic Pools. Been building pools my entire life. I'm a state certified pool contractor for 15 years. So Legacy Pools was a pool contractor that started just before COVID, operated during COVID. I don't know the exact years, for around 3 to 4 years, and then went out of business, leaving customers with unfinished pools. So Chad Black owned Legacy Pools. He worked for a different pool contractor before he started Legacy Pools, but he only worked for a very short period of time. After that, he obtained a state certified pool contractor license through the state. In my mind, he was not qualified to own a pool contractor business, meaning he didn't have the experience. He was a designer for the other pool company. He never had any experience running a business or running the finances. So let's start with Legacy Pools. So guys, one of the biggest things that I saw, the biggest red flag I saw, and I saw this from the beginning, when you own a pool contracting business, you can see the insides of another business. So they were selling very custom pools with high-end features for very cheap. Guys, that is the biggest red flag that I see. You know, if you know, everybody thinks that pool contractors mark these pools up a ton and they have a lot of wiggle room. Let's say you're purchasing a $100,000 pool. A lot of customers think that pool contractors are marking these pools up. Let's say that, you know, they think that the pool costs $50,000 to build, that the profit margin is 100%, meaning that there's $50,000 of profit on top. Therefore, if someone, you know, takes off $30,000 and makes it a $70,000 pool, that is still a profitable pool. That is very far from the truth. And if you've ever, you know, wondered why pool contractors don't just work on one pool at a time, it's because of that. The margins are very low in swimming pools. Therefore, as a business, we have to, you know, work on 10, 15 pools projects at a time to maintain the overhead of the business. Now, when you're an unexperienced builder like Chad Black was with Legacy Pools, you don't understand the costs that are involved. You don't understand, you know, that you can't do that. So when he was selling these high-end projects, you know, these pool spa, waterfall, screen enclosures with travertine decks and pebble surfaces and glass tile, that's all really expensive stuff. You know, for $50,000, there's no way to even build that pool for that cost. So what happens is you get backwards. So now you're selling pool number 2 to float pool number 1, and you're selling pool number 3 to float pool number 2 and 1, and eventually what happens is you get so far backwards that the business begins to fail. It's not profitable. And it's normal for a business not to be profitable for the first couple of years, but that's not how it works. You don't sell projects for cheap and go under. What you do is you reinvest the profits, so you don't take profits out of the business. So you're still selling pools for what they should be sold for in this exact, you know, example, but you are selling, you know, you're taking those profits and you're reinvesting. Maybe you're buying work trucks, maybe you're hiring new people, maybe you're spending it on a location, meaning a brick and mortar location, maybe you're buying tools, maybe you're stockpiling supplies, but the money, the profit's still there. You're just using it instead of the owners of the company taking it and paying themselves a salary. They're reinvesting in the business. So when you guys are getting bids, you know, you can't, if you get 2 bids at 160 grand and one's at 120, you know, I understand it's tempting as a customer, but that is a bait and switch scenario, and that's what, you know, Legacy Pools is doing. So what happened is he started during COVID, you know, and COVID was a giant everything changed during COVID in the pool industry. Everything. Pools went from being $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to $100,000 in a year because of the materials and supplies. Labor costs went up. Every cost went through the roof because of supply and demand. The supply wasn't there, the demand was high, and the reason the demand was so high for swimming pools is property values went sky high, interest rates went way low. We've never seen interest rates that were 3%, 2%. We've never seen that, in the history. And so people were either refinancing their properties, they were buying and selling their properties, they were moving down here from New York. I'm just, giving out examples. They sold their little house in New York for $2 million. They bought a house down here for $500,000, $600,000. They got a bunch of extra money. Everybody was buying, kitchens, roofs, bathrooms, pools. It wasn't just pools that they were buying. They were just upgrading their houses because they weren't going on vacation. And the same thing for boats. I mean, the boat sales went crazy during COVID. So that opens up the window for somebody to come in and sell a bunch of pools because customers were used to a certain price, pool being $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and now they're $100,000, and people were not used to, they weren't conditioned to the higher prices. So when another company came in, there's only one way in my mind that a new company is going to sell a ton of pools, is that they come in with a low price because they don't have the referral base, meaning they don't have customers that are referring them. They don't have, connections yet. There's really, there's very few reasons. And I'm not saying they can't do it. Obviously some people are better than others at business. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying that it's very, very rare that someone starts out in business, sells a ton of pools, and blows the business up like crazy. Usually, like I took 15 years to build my business, so we're still considered a small business in the realm of things. I mean, there's companies that are building 1,000, 1,500 pools a year, when we're building, 100. Right? So we're still a small business because I don't want to grow too fast. You make too many mistakes, and we're learning. We learn every day, whether it's business, whether it's how to build pools better, and products are consistently changing, so we're constantly adapting. So when you run into a story like Legacy Pools, do I think that guy, started that business and said, I'm going to create, a fraudulent business? Probably not. I mean, my mind's still teeter-tottering. Me personally, I think he was just a bad businessman. I think that he didn't understand the costs that were involved. Everybody, looks at pool contractors and goes, oh my God, they're getting rich. It's very far from the truth, and what happens is he got so far backwards from selling these projects for cheap that, you dig a hole that you can't get out of. And then he was taking loans. He took an SBA loan for a couple $1 million. He took, short-term loans. Short-term loans will just kill you because they're very high interest. You got to pay them back weekly, and eventually you just dig a hole that you can't get out of. And that's what happened. So guys, as a customer, you have to be aware of this, so you don't fall for this again, because it's not happening right now. I don't want to say that it's happening right now, but I see these same red flags in other businesses that happen with Legacy Pools. I mean, when they're undercutting us by $40,000, $50,000 on a project, that's just not possible. And I know it's tempting for you guys as a customer to go, oh my God, I'm getting a great deal. It's just not possible, and you guys need to understand that, and that's why I'm telling you this story, is to, relate it to, trying to get you guys to make wise decisions so you don't end up on the news telling your story of a half-finished pool. And the quality of work was super low with those pools. When you're constantly fighting to pay subcontractors, pay material suppliers, pay everybody, your employees, that means you get bottom of the barrel subs, bottom of the barrel employees, bottom of the barrel, materials and supplies. You're just fighting to stay alive. The best of the best is not going to work for you. So the quality of work is going to be very low. And I mean, the pool may look great. I mean, there were people that got their pools out of Legacy Pools. They did. They were the lucky few, but the majority were left with an open hole. And another thing that this guy was doing, because he was so money hungry, because he needed money to stay alive, is he was asking for draws before they were due. As a company, we have our milestone draws, and we take them throughout the project. That way we stay pretty even with work that's done to the money that's taken in, and we, that's how we do it. So if someone's asking for the gunite draw before they even dig the pool, that's a red flag, So you guys need to be wise. So Legacy Pools, let's jump back to that and tell the full story. He just got over backwards. There was things that he were doing that wasn't correct. He was running stuff through the church, which I'm not going to get too much in detail with, but that stuff was immorally, not correct. It under no circumstance should anybody do that. And what he was doing is he was trying to basically commit tax fraud. He was, churches are tax exempt because they're nonprofits. So he was buying materials and supplies with the church credit card, and paying the church credit card with the company, which means that it's a write-off because it shows as a donation to the church. So, that was a way around taxes. And there's some details I'm not going to get into, guys. But, the general thing was that Legacy Pools was selling pools for too cheap, offering a product that was, too good to resist. Who doesn't want a pool that's Mac Daddy pool with an awesome screen closure, beautiful glass tile, pebble surface, for $50,000? Who wouldn't want to do that? I understand that. So when you guys are getting pool bids, what do you look for so this doesn't happen to you? Well, the biggest thing is when you get 3 estimates, which don't get more than 3 estimates. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. People take a retail mentality to the swimming pool industry, meaning that if let's say you're in the market for a Louis Vuitton purse, right? And you go to 5 different places and you say, hey, George's shop over here is offering this Louis Vuitton purse for $200 cheaper. I want you to give me that price. At the end of the day, the reason you can do that with a retail product is because at the end of the day, you're still taking home the retail product built by the same or made by the same manufacturer, meaning Louis Vuitton in this instance, and it's the same product. So you can go around and kick some tires and beat people up over price, and on a retail product, the margins are huge. They're a lot higher than construction, and those margins, that we're talking about, that's not just swimming pools, that's construction in general, but if you take a retail mentality to a swimming pool and you get 6 or 7 bids and you go, hey, this company's cheaper, this company's this, and kind of play, against each other and see which one's going to sharpen their pencil more. Well, then once you go with this cheaper guy, he's got to build the pool. That's the difference between retail and construction. Now that guy has to build the pool. So if he just sold this pool for super cheap just to get the job, well, now he's like, dang it, I got to build this pool. So he's going to cut corners. He's going to let it sit for a while he funds, your project with other projects. There's a slew of things that could happen. Or he could go out of business like Legacy Pools and leave you stranded. And that's another thing. When a furniture company goes out of business, right? They have a flash sale. Everybody's happy. They get a bunch of discounted items. No big deal. Oh, that sucks. The company went out of business. Well, when a pool business or any kind of construction business that builds a lot of projects goes out of business, they leave customers with unfinished projects. So it's not that they are committing fraud or trying to commit fraud. It's just how it is, guys. If we close the door today, my company, Aquatic Pools, we are going to leave unfinished projects, in the ground. So you guys need to understand that it's not, don't be scared that construction companies are creating fraud. It's just if a construction business goes out of business, they're going to leave unfinished projects. If they run out of money, that's why they go out of business, right? There's no, we'll finish all the projects. They don't have any money to finish the projects. And I hear a lot of people say, oh, they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Well, the money that companies take in are used for a whole bunch of stuff. we don't have 15 different bank accounts that we're allocating. We have an in-house accountant, so we keep tight track of costs, expenses, how much money's brought in, all that good stuff. But all the money goes into a generic account, and if there's overhead and stuff, we pay it with that. So, that's how companies operate. This is no secret. This is how companies operate. So it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's that, that money comes in and money goes out. That's the end of it. So guys, if you're getting, 3 bids and you get 2 bids for 160 and one's 120, there is no way that anybody can build that pool for $120,000. There is not $40,000 in that project of profit. Go ahead and throw that $120,000 in the trash can, because that is a bait and switch scenario. Don't even think about going to those other pool companies and saying, hey, I got a guy that's 120, can you match that? No, because that company probably sees value in their product, meaning that they have to maintain a certain profit margin to operate as a company, guys. And that's not being greedy, right? That is staying alive. That is life. That is 100% truth. If there's not a healthy company, right, they're not going to build your pool good. They're going to be cutting corners. They're going to be using crappy subs, crappy employees, crappy materials, so it's just not possible. Now, I'm going to give you a perfect example. I have a customer that's coming in here today to sign a pool. It is almost the exact scenario that I just told you about. He got 3 bids, right? Ours was, I think, 187. Another pool company's was 185. It was within a couple grand, so it was very, very similar. And then he had one guy that came in at 120. That's $60-something thousand difference, and the customer was leery. So he came in, he showed me the $120,000 estimate, and he said, what's your honest opinion about that? And I said, throw it in the trash can. And that's not me just being biased. I explained to him why, and he was like, thank you. We ended up signing that job, or we're signing it later today. Awesome couple, great people, and I think the reason why he didn't do that is because this is his second pool being built in Brevard County. The first pool that he got built, he didn't have a great experience. He's not using that same contractor. And so I see that a lot with people that have already got a pool built, that they're way smarter when they choose a second contractor. Guys, you have to look at the contractor you're picking. You don't go with the salesman that you like. You don't go with the cheapest guy. You go with the person that you in your heart feels like is going to do the best job possible. And there definitely is, when you're getting in the realm of contractors, there definitely is higher quality contractors. I mean, I know one that same $187,000 pool, or whatever our cost was, he probably would have been, in the 200s. But that guy is crazy good. I'm talking about crazy good. So there is quality, and sometimes you're going to get a guy that's higher, but generally there's a reason. It's not that, hey, I'm being greedy, I'm doing this. It's because he works on 1 or 2 pools at a time, and that's what he needs to charge to cover his overhead as a business. Therefore, if he works on a couple projects, he has to charge more because he's only working on a couple projects. A general, normal pool company is going to be working on 10 plus projects at a time, right? They're going to have different crews that do different. They're going to have dig, form, and steel guys. They're going to have tile guys, plumbers, deck guys. They're going to have, guys that install the equipment. They're going to have electricians. They're going to have different crews that do different things. Some of them are in-house, some of them are subcontractors. Using subcontractors, every company uses subcontractors. If they say they don't, they're lying to your face. State of Florida requires us to use licensed electricians for electrical work. That's just one example. We are not licensed to do electrical work. That's just how it is. So, guys, when you're getting these estimates, you need to be leery of these low estimates and these new people. Let's talk about that. New contractors. If they're not, if you guys need to be treating this as you are like in a hiring process for your company. Let's say you pretend you own a company. These contractors that you're interviewing, you need to act like you're in a job interview, right? Don't just look at price. If someone comes in and let's say you're offering a job for $100,000 a year, and someone comes in and says, "Hey, I'll do this job, and you can pay me a salary of $40,000, a year." Do you think that person is going to be any good at what they do? Probably not. They're desperate. They need work. If someone's work is desirable, they're, for one, they're going to have a backlog of work, and for two, they're going to see quality in it. They're going to want a higher cost for what they do. It's the same thing with contractors. If you're just, in my mind, I would act like if I got 3 estimates, I would act like the price isn't even a thing. Who in my heart do I think is going to do the best job? And not just looking at the salesman, meaning that, oh, this guy's a really nice guy. This guy, is he knowledgeable? You know what I mean? Like this guy's got to build my pool. Maybe he's not the exact guy that's building your pool, but he's representing the company that builds the pool. What does this guy know? Ask some technical questions. And I understand you guys don't know a lot about pools, but, ask things. You'll find out if he knows what he's talking about. Feel him out. Say, hey, how exactly are you going to construct this retaining wall? How exactly are you going to install this tile? How exactly, ask detailed questions. What kind of concrete are you going to use? What kind of, spray deck, if you're going to spray texture, are you going to use? And if that guy goes, we buy it from Sherwin-Williams. Well, that guy doesn't know a lot. If I say, hey, we're using Tech 2100, blah, 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 blah. I've been doing this for years. I prefer that product because of this, this, and this. Well, that means I know what I'm talking about. I'm talking from experience. So a lot of these new contractors, especially in the area, because those are the ones that I'm familiar with, they didn't work for other companies. Right? They don't have the knowledge. They haven't done the work. They haven't, I grew up doing the work. Like I've done every step of everything. Therefore, if a customer asks me a technical question, and don't get me wrong, I'm learning things every day, but there's a dang good chance I'm going to be able to answer that question. I'm going to be able to answer that question in grave detail where they're like, oh my God, okay, this guy knows what he's talking about. That's what you guys need to look for. Because if you go with the cheap guy, and let's say you get that pool, you go with the cheap guy and you're lucky and you get the pool, it's going to be a thorn in your side. He's going to use cheap parts, everything's going to break in a year or two, and guess what? Now you're going to have to pay me to fix it, and it's going to cost you a lot because I got to take 10 steps backwards before I can take 1 step forward, which ends up costing you, the consumer, money. So I have a saying that says money saved now is money spent later, and it's true. So you guys really need to think when you're hiring these contractors, and I'm just talking about swimming pools in specific, about who is going to do the best job. If a contractor is only installing one product, meaning if you look at all his pools, and I'm just throwing out one example, and all of his pool decks are pavers, and oh, do you do travertine? No, I haven't done a travertine. Oh, do you do concrete? No, I haven't done a concrete. All they do is pavers. Well, that's because they don't know how to do travertine. They don't know how to do concrete. And they don't, you know what I mean? They're just doing what they think's the easiest thing, and they're just banging out a pool, and we're over there looking at it like, oh, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. You know what I mean? You're the science project. You're they're figuring out how to do things, and a good person will figure out how to do it and get better and better and better. That's fine. You know what I mean? But in reality, you want somebody that worked for another company. You know what I mean? Same thing if you're hiring somebody, right? They have the experience, blah, blah, blah. Then they start their own business, and they continue to get better and better and better. But they've already had the experience. Maybe they're learning how to run a business. Maybe they're learning how to sell. Maybe they're learning how to market. But they know how to build a pool, which at the end of the day is the most important thing to you guys. So guys, I'm telling this story, to try to help you guys. I'm not trying to scare you guys. There are great people in our industry. We really do have a great network of people in Brevard County that build pools, and I'm proud to be a pool contractor in the area. So guys, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. please like and subscribe. That helps us tremendously. People call us, people email us, people leave comments all the time asking us the most random questions. We're here for you. We want to help you guys. We're not trying to sway you guys. We're just trying to educate. So thank you guys for watching. Have a great day.